Good morning, afternoon, everyone. My name is Brandon, and today, Group 5 will be presenting a strategic analysis of vertical integration, supply chain agility, and resilience, and a comparison of the Canadian versus U.S. policy for semiconductor manufacturing for Medicom. Medicom is a global leader in personal protective equipment, or PPE, with a strong emphasis on building a resilient supply chain, a critical factor in their continued success. Our discussion will focus on the case study, Medicom, Building a Resilient Supply Chain, and the decisions we explore today revolve around how Medicom can leverage multiple elements to strengthen their supply chain, improve efficiencies, and mitigate their risk. Before diving into the first topic, vertical integration, let's first set the stage with some background on Medicom's operating environment and strategic challenges. Medicom operates in the global PPE industry, which, as we all experienced firsthand during the COVID-19 pandemic, is an industry where demand can fluctuate rapidly and unpredictably. PPE is a critical component of the public health and safety, and this puts an intense pressure on companies like Medicom to ensure reliable supply chains, even in the face of global disruptions. In the case study, the author emphasizes the challenges Medicom faced in maintaining supply chain resilience during the pandemic, and these included items such as shortages of raw materials, logistical delays, and overall reliance on third-party suppliers. A key takeaway that was Medicom must continuously improve its supply chain resilience to be prepared for future disruptions. This is where the vertical integration comes into play. By integrating more stages of the supply chain, Medicom could potentially reduce its vulnerability to these disruptions and create a more agile and reliable supply network. However, while vertical integration offers many potential benefits, it also brings some significant challenges too, which we'll explore next. All right, let's begin by discussing the advantages of vertical integration for Medicom. First, one of the clearest advantages is enhanced supply chain control. By vertically integrating, Medicom could take ownership of critical supply chain stages, such as raw material procurement, manufacturing, or even their distribution. And this would give Medicom a greater control over their supply sources, reducing dependency on the third-party suppliers, and then mitigating the risk of disruptions, something the case study underscored as a vital step towards a more resilient supply chain. This control could also allow Medicom to guarantee availability in times of crises, like the one we saw with COVID-19. Second, vertical integration can lead to cost reductions. Through economies of scale, when Medicom controls multiple stages of the production, it can streamline operations, eliminating the middleman and creating a way more cost-efficient supply chain. This could be particularly valuable in helping Medicom reduce costs while maintaining the quality of their PPE products, thus reinforcing the competitive advantages emphasized in the case study. Third, improved quality control is another significant advantage. As mentioned in the case study, consistency in quality is non-negotiable for Medicom's brand and their reputation. So by controlling more of the supply chain, Medicom would have more direct oversight and the ability to enforce high-quality standards across the board. And this could prevent quality issues that might arise from outsourcing to third parties and help further establish Medicom as a reliable provider in the global PPE market. Lastly, vertical integration offers the potential for increased innovation with greater control over the entire production process. Internal teams can collaborate more effectively across all the stages, and then from material development to the final product assembly, this collaboration can foster innovation in these new products, designs, materials, or processes, allowing Medicom to stay ahead of the curve and meet the evolving customer needs. As the case study discussed, supply chain flexibility and innovation are critical for long-term success. However, while the benefits of vertical integration are clear, there are also some significant disadvantages that Medicom must consider. All right, first, the most immediate downside is the significant capital investment required. Expanding into the new areas of the supply chain, whether through acquisitions or by building, say, new facilities, demands substantial upfront costs. These investments could limit Medicom's financial flexibility, which could become a challenge, especially in an unpredictable market environment, as highlighted in the case study. Financial constraints could also limit the financial opportunities like expanding global operations or investing in new technologies. Second, vertical integration could introduce operational complexity. As Medicom adds more stages to its supply chain, it also adds layers and layers of complexity that need to be managed. Coordinating manufacturing, logistics, quality control across multiple business units can be time consuming and requires additional management resources. As the case study mentions, managing this complexity while keeping the supply chain resilient would require more sophisticated systems and processes. Third, vertical integration can reduce flexibility in responding to the changes in the market demand. For example, if the demand for a particular type of PPE declines, Medicom may find itself stuck with an excess of production capacity, leading to inefficiencies. As we saw during the pandemic, the ability to pivot quickly was crucial for these companies, and a vertical integrated supply chain might limit Medicom's agility in certain situations. So, a point raised in the case study when they were discussing supply chain responsiveness. Finally, vertical integration could expose Medicom to additional regulatory risk. Expanding these new areas of the supply chain could require a compliance with more environmental, labor, or safety regulations. This would increase Medicom's exposure to regulatory scrutiny, potentially raising costs and further complications to their operation. In the case study, regulatory compliance was noted as an area of concern when expanding into the new markets or operations. All right, in conclusion, vertical integration offers Medicom both significant opportunities and substantial risk. On one hand, it can provide greater control over the supply chain, potentially lowering costs and improving quality, and fostering innovation. These benefits could help Medicom build a more resilient and efficient supply chain, a key theme in the study. But on the other hand, the strategy comes with the financial, operational, and regulatory risk, all of which must be carefully considered. The decision to pursue a vertical integration will depend on Medicom's willingness to make the necessary investments, managing the added complexity, and then maintaining the flexibility needed to adapt in an ever-changing market. Ultimately, this decision should align with Medicom's broader goal of building a resilient supply chain, one that can weather future disruptions while ensuring the company remains a global leader in the PPE. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
I'm going to be discussing the difference between supply chain agility and supply chain resilience. Supply chain agility refers to a company's ability to quickly adapt in changes of demand, market shifts, and consumer needs. It is characterized by the speed and flexibility in production, sourcing, and distribution, allowing companies to respond swiftly and efficiently to short-term fluctuations. Agility enables businesses to make rapid adjustments, ensuring they can keep up with dynamic market conditions and stay competitive. On the other hand, supply chain resilience is the capability to withstand and recover from significant disruptions or crises. Resilient supply chains are equipped to handle unexpected events such as natural disasters, supply chain shortages, or economic shocks. This is achieved by implementing buffers like safety stock, diversifying suppliers, and building redundancies into operations. Resilience focuses heavily on risk management and mitigation strategies, ensuring the business can continue operating despite the substantial changes. Agility and resilience are essential for a modern, effective supply chain. Companies can develop these capabilities simultaneously, however, achieving this requires careful planning and balancing of priorities. Agility and resilience are complementary in many ways. Agility allows a company to react quickly to minor disruptions or market changes, helping to capture opportunities or avoid immediate threats. Resilience, on the other hand, provides the foundation for handling larger, more significant disruptions that could cause long-term harm if not managed properly. Despite the benefits of developing both capabilities, there are some challenges. For instance, managing the costs associated with building resilience, such as maintaining extra inventory or developing relationship with backup suppliers, can conflict with the lean principles often associated with agility. Agility typically seeks streamlined operations and minimize waste, while resilience may require additional resources and redundancy. Therefore, companies must find the right balance, ensuring they can respond quickly to a short-term change while maintaining the strength to recover from a long-term disruption.
In this section, we will be comparing and contrasting Canadian and US policy. Canadian policy, of course, through Medicom, and US policy in regards to semiconductor manufacturing. We will look at how these policies are similar in regards to bringing production back to their respective countries, but how they each went about this in different ways. At first glance, these differences seem obvious. They're two completely different industries, but there are similarities in their approach. We will look at these two policies, of course, through the lens of the COVID-19 pandemic, because this was a time of great turmoil within the supply chain for multiple countries, and so it seems fitting. So, Medicom is going to be the first company we talk about here in the comparison. Medicom makes personal protective equipment, or PPE, for a whole bunch of different companies. They're based in Canada, but unfortunately, Canada during COVID did not have domestic production at the very beginning. And so um, Canada really needed a solution. They were having to import a lot of their PPE materials in order to make these different masks and other equipment used in hospitals and for daily life for people all across of Canada. And so um, the government decided to award Medicom a 10-year contract and say, hey, we don't like the fact that we have to rely on foreign nations to get our products like melt blown materials in order to create these masks. And so we want to um, award you this contract, and we want you to bring production here to Canada and domestically make melt blown products, melt blown materials, so that we have a steady supply in the event that we have another COVID pandemic situation in the future. Right? Canada was looking to reduce its risk when it comes to having enough product, and so this seemed to be a logical step. What Medicom decided to do with this contract was to build a factory in Montreal. This factory would be able to support all of the needs, all of the demands that Canada would have. And when there were non peak times, they can then support sites in either the US or in Europe when they needed additional supply of masks. So they can meet all of the demand in Canada and then help other countries around the world meet their own demand when Canada did not require this material. Now, with creating this factory and bringing production back to Canada and producing domestically, Medicom had a lot of concerns, and they were concerned with different types of risk. One, they were concerned with their lack of experience. They were excited for the possibility of being able to control their own supply and to innovate and make the production of melt blown materials better, but they didn't know how good they could get at that process since they hadn't done it. All of their stuff was outsourced to other countries in either Asia or the US or Europe. Another concern that they had were agility concerns. If the if Medicom decided to continue to outsource to its suppliers, great, they could keep costs low and then pass those cost savings on to either the Canadian government or the Canadian people. But they were concerned with their agility. It goes along with that. When there were peak demand times that they couldn't get supplies of melt blown technology of materials from their suppliers because they were supplying so many other countries, well, that would put Canada in a bind. And so Medicom really struggled with what to do. And later on, we'll kind of talk about how they tackled these concerns. So the second part of this comparison is US policy, of course, and it is the semiconductor manufacturing field as a whole. During COVID, the US government had a huge spike in demand for semiconductor chips, right? These different processing chips in computers and cars, and it was a hugely critical component in American goods. People were consuming all of these different products that had these chips in there, and demand simply outpaced supply. And so the US needed to find a way to balance that out and to increase supply so that they could then um, have more goods, not only for consumer goods, but also for defense and for all these other needs that they just couldn't fill at that time. And so what the United States decides to do is not to award a contract like Canada did, but instead to sign into uh, effect a plan that would finance U.S. chip production. President Biden signed this plan that would provide $50 billion to chip manufacturers to bring production back to the United States. And this was on top of what these countries were already planning to do to help bring back this production. One of these companies was Intel. Intel decided to invest its own capital and to take some of these funds given by the US government and expand their factory in Arizona. And on top of that, they were planning to build a new factory in Ohio. So we kind of see both of these companies, right? Medicom in Montreal building a factory, Intel expanding and building factories in Arizona and Ohio, respectively. These factories were put into development, right? They started developing this production capability during COVID-19 to hopefully meet the skyrocketing demand. But what some of these companies quickly realize and have realized as we've gone out of COVID is that that was peak demand. That was as high as demand was going to possibly get because everybody's at home and they have money and they don't know what to do with it. So they start buying things, cars, computers, phones, etc., etc. And so demand is like it says here, skyrocketing. Very similar to Canada and their issues with their PPE, right? During COVID, they need this protective equipment. And so Medicom is trying to provide that. Well, they can't meet the demand because they don't have domestic production, so we need to bring those things back. The US, right, and these chip manufacturers have a lot of concern coming out of COVID, similar to that of Medicom. What does the future look like? How do we forecast coming out of COVID what our demand is going to look like and how much supply to have to meet that demand? In the article, it talks about many companies having a lot of uncertainty. And so there are some companies out there that are starting to aggressively cut their inventory because they don't want to have this inventory and sit on it for months and months or even years as this demand downturn is sort of getting underway. And so we have two companies, the US, or we have two different policies, US policy and Canadian policy, very similar in that the countries are funding different projects to help end these large swings in demand, right? Or to at least try to mitigate these large swings in demand. One way with contracts, and the other just happens to be with this finance plan. And in the next sections, you will see kind of how these plans differ, right? So there's some similarities here, but there's also differences. In the next sections, we'll talk about those.
Now we want to address two issues that affected Medicom's supply chain in a health crisis. The first is the effects on demand. Now if you think about it, a health crisis has a contagion that spreads extremely fast, and as a result the demand is going to spike fast. So you have this curve with a spike in demand, and manufacturing can't keep up right away, so they need time to increase capacity to create the supply and then distribute the products. In this case would be PPE products, especially masks. And then eventually the crisis settles down and demand dries up. And from all that ramping up at the overcapacity, manufacturers left with idle capacity and excess inventory. It's essentially supply chain worst case scenario or nightmare scenario. Secondly, when supply chain disruptions from the public sector affect a country's economy, public well-being, or national security, they can reveal where their loyalties lie. And they can switch from, for example, a free trade society to more domestic favoritism. In fact, in times of war, as we've seen with the most recent Ukraine war, supply chains can be weaponized against different countries, such as withholding supplies of or exports of grain and oil. With COVID, countries took more of a protectionist stance. China, in fact, seized Medicom's mask production factories and inserted their own employees and supplied only their domestic populations. Taiwan banned exports as well, and France took similar measures. Now, the demand swings that we mentioned can cause real havoc with cash flows. So as the demand goes up, there's a huge cash outflow to increase capacity, and then they sell off and make their profits, and then when demand dies down, they're stuck with inventory and holding costs. So companies would need to find a way to level this out somehow. One way to do this typically would be to outsource supplies, since demand is so uncertain. And this would allow suppliers of like raw materials, the ones needed, for example, in these N95 masks, to aggregate across different industries and all their different customers. So those masks can be used outside of the healthcare industries such as construction, chemical manufacturing, food production, oil and gas. The way Medicom approached this was to seek out purchase commitments through government contracts. And they did this successfully with Canada, Singapore, France, and the UK. Now, the problem with outsourcing is what we've seen with other countries actually seizing control of assets. So, unfortunately, it forces companies to have to consider a sovereign supply chain, which effectively is vertical integration, having every part of the supply chain, from the raw materials all the way through distribution, exist within their home country. So Canada, for example, would have to create a melt-blown raw materials factory to be able to have that. And because if there's a outsourced company supplying the world effectively, wherever that exists, that country could in effect take control of it and cut off supplies and take down a whole industry until demand is relieved. So America, measures they took during the crisis with the semiconductors around the pandemic was to implement an executive order, which was basically a review of all supply chain risks. And they took a look at all of the most important things to the economy, such as rare earth elements, food production, EV batteries is a huge thing now, semiconductors, of course, and pharmaceuticals. And Canada recognized a vulnerability in their transportation sector. So they created a supply chain task force to try to address and mitigate any disruptions with their supply chain. So in our final recommendation is for a country to do exactly that, is to assess and do a stress test of how the country would function economically in times of crisis, times of conflict, and natural disasters. Taking this approach could lead to isolationism and negate the benefits of global trade. So we would recommend implementing channels that do encourage global trade, but have essentially an emergency backup plan to create domestic supply chains from start to finish, and also consider integrating supply chains with their allies.